the iron discipline of its legions, and its unwavering revolutionary expansion. Carthage, the heir to ancient Phoenicia, was a thalassocracy, a maritime empire whose wealth and power were built on an extensive network of trade routes that controlled the entire Western Mediterranean. Their clash was inevitable, for Rome's ambitions could not coexist with Carthage's maritime supremacy, and Carthage could not stand idly by and watch the growth of the continental giant's power, which threatened its commercial interests.
Thus, from the outset, the Punic Wars were something more than a war for territory or resources. They were a battle for total domination of the Mediterranean, an existential conflict between two civilizations in which there could be only one winner. The stakes were extremely high. The loser risked losing not only their possessions and influence, but also their very right to exist. It was this uncompromising attitude that gave rise to the cruelty and stubbornness with which both sides were very cautious. Each victory and each defeat only served to fuel mutual hatred, turning the conflict into a protracted and exhausting drama. In the end, this centuries-old enmity crystallized in one short but terrifying phrase, the old quintessence of Roman policy toward its main enemy. Carthago dolenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Cicero.
First Punic War, the war for Sicily. The outbreak of the first major conflict between Rome and Carthage was inevitable, and the strategically important island of Sicily became the arena for this titanic struggle. This fertile island, located in the heart of the Mediterranean, was not only a coveted piece of land, but also the key to dominance in relations. Control of Sicily, and in particular the narrow Strait of Messina separating it from the Apennine Peninsula, meant control of important trade routes. It was here, in the region behind this key point, that the ambitions of the two powers collided, leading to the prologue to a protracted and bloody war. Carthage, the ruler of the seas with centuries of experience, traditionally considered these waters its own. Rome, a powerful land power, turned its gaze to the sea for the first time, realizing that without a strong fleet it could not defeat its main rival. This realization led to one of the boldest decisions in Roman history. Faced with the superiority of the Carthaginian fleet, the Romans did the almost impossible. They created a national navy for the first time in their history. This step marked the beginning of a new era in Roman military strategy. The waves of the Mediterranean Sea turned into a battlefield where galleys clashed. Imagine this scene. Under the scorching sun, two giant fleets converge. On one side are the sleek and fast ships of the Carthaginians, commanded by experienced sailors. On the other, massive Roman galleys, built for one purpose, to crush the enemy. The air is filled with the creaking of oars, the commands of captains, and the battle cries of legionnaires ready to board. The ships collided with a deafening crash, breaking oars and hulls. This was not just a naval battle. It was a battle between two worlds, two different approaches to warfare, unfolding on the endless expanse of the sea.
During the grueling naval battles, Rome, showing incredible resilience and adaptability, gradually maintained the initiative. Victory in the First Punic War not only gave Rome control of Sicily, but more importantly, turned it into a new and
opposed to the traditional Roman doctrine based on decisive field battles. Fabius understood perfectly well that Hannibal was practically invincible in open combat. Therefore, he began a war of attrition. His legions relentlessly pursued the Carthaginian army, keeping it constantly on edge, making small raids on foragers and supply units, but resolutely avoiding general supply lines. This scorched earth tactic and the constant slowing down of Hannibal's advance deprived him of resources and opportunities to gain a foothold on Italian soil. While the Carthaginian forces wandered through hostile territory, slowly but surely melting away from their native shores, Rome gained precious time to recover from the shock, restore morale, and recruit and train new legions.
While Fabius methodically wore down the enemy in Italy, a new figure emerged on the historical scene who was determined to turn the tide of war. The young and ambitious commander Publius Cornelius Scipio. He realized that passive defense, however effective, would not bring ultimate victory. Scipio proposed a bold plan to stop focusing exclusively on defending Italy and start a war on the defensive lines. His strategy culminated in a deadly blow that was vital to the center of Carthage, depriving Hannibal of support and resources. The first step was to expand operations in Spain. This region was not only a source of silver for Carthage, but also a crucial base for recruiting mercenaries. Scipio's successful campaigns in Spain undermined the enemy's economic and military power, creating a springboard for Rome's further advances. The culmination of his strategic thinking was to move the war directly to North Africa. This move proved to be brilliant. It forced the Carthaginian Senate to panic and recall Hannibal from Italy to defend his native city. Thus, the main threat that had been tormenting Rome was neutralized, not in a direct confrontation on its terms, but by a skillful strategic maneuver. The Roman strategy, which had gone from desperate resistance to a bold counter-offensive, echoed the words of one historian: "It is not the one who strikes first who wins, but the one who endures and strikes last." Rome endured and prepared to strike with its decisive blow. The second confrontation, Hannibal's crossing of the Alps and the fortress on land. The second act of the great confrontation between Rome and Carthage revealed a world figure who became synonymous with military genius and unyielding will: Hannibal Barca. After his defeat at sea in the First Punic War, the Carthaginian commander realized that a new conflict required a completely different approach. He chose a path that seemed pure madness and the height of military audacity to his contemporaries. His plan was brilliant in its simplicity: strike at the very heart of the German Republic by invading Italy by land. To do this, his army had to accomplish what was considered impossible: cross the icy, impassable passes of the Alps. This maneuver was a strategic move aimed at shaking Rome to its foundations and breaking its spirit. Hannibal led not only soldiers
a masterful ambush in the morning fog, completely defeated and almost completely destroyed the entire consular army. However, the apogee of Hannibal's glory and the elegant catastrophe in the history of Rome was the brilliant Battle of Cannae. Here his tactics reached perfection. He deliberately weakened his center, allowing the vastly superior forces of the Roman legions to be drawn deep into his formation. It was a trap. As soon as the Romans rushed forward, the powerful flanks of the Carthaginian army closed like giant pincers, trapping the movement in a deadly ring. The following hours turned not into a battle, but into a methodical destruction. The defeat was complete and crushing. The Battle of Cannae went down in history as a benchmark of tactical mastery and one of Rome's most tragic days, proving that the genius of one man could bring a powerful empire to its knees.
Outcome of the Second War, the Battle of Zama and the defeat of Carthage. The transfer of military operations to the African continent, carried out by the astute strategist Publius Cornelius Scipio, became a turning point in the entire Second Punic War. This bold move forced the Carthaginian Senate to hastily recall its main hope, Hannibal Barca, from Italy, where he had been terrorizing the Romans for a century and a half. The fate of the two great powers was to be decided by the main battle of the day, which took place in the autumn of 202 BC under special conditions near the city of Zama. It was not just a battle, it was the culmination of many years of exhausting struggle, a clash of two worlds, two military geniuses whose names have remained forever in the annals of history. The field of power turned into an arena for the final decisive duel between two elegant commanders of their era. On one side stood Hannibal, a name that became synonymous with military enemies and crushing victories, a man who made Rome tremble. On the other was the young but no less brilliant Scipio, who had studied his enemy's tactics and managed to find an effective countermeasure. Their meeting on the battlefield was like a clash of titans. Behind each stood not just an army, but the fate of their civilizations. The air was thick with tension. Every warrior, from the lowly legionnaire to the centurion, from the mercenary to the Carthaginian citizen, knew that everything depended on the outcome of this battle.
Hannibal created the terrifying power of war elephants, placing about 80 of these giants in front of his army to destroy the Roman troops. However, Scipio was prepared for this. He had instructed his soldiers in advance on how to act. The legionaries were to create corridors in their ranks and let the animals pass through, while the cavalry and infantry showered them with a hail of javelins and deafened them with the roar of trumpets and horns. The plan worked brilliantly. Driven mad by pain and noise, the elephants, instead of crushing the Romans, turned around and caused confusion in their own ranks, especially on the flanks of the Carthaginian cavalry. Taking advantage of this confusion, the superior Roman and Numidian cavalry, under the command of Scipio's loyal ally, Massinissa, attacked Hannibal's fleeing cavalry and then rushed to the rear of the Carthaginian infantry. Deprived of flank cover and attacked from the rear, Hannibal's army, even its most distinguished veterans, could not withstand the coordinated onslaught of the Roman legions and was defeated.
conflict that determined the fate of the Mediterranean. This final stage of the confrontation between Rome and Carthage unfolded several decades after Hannibal's crushing defeat at Zama. Although Carthage was broken, stripped of its overseas territories, and burdened with heavy reparations, the specter of the former enemy continued to live on in the hearts of the Romans. The spirit of irreconcilability and thirst for complete revenge was fueled by the fear that the defeated enemy would one day rise from the ashes and challenge the eternal city once again. The Roman Senate's uncompromising position, expressed in the famous phrase, became the leitmotif of Rome's entire foreign policy toward its old enemy. The pretext for the beginning of the end was one of Carthage's border disputes with Rome's Numidian allies. Rome, which had long been looking for a reason to finally settle the score, immediately intervened. The Roman Senate issued an ultimatum that was tantamount to a death sentence. According to a little-known fact, one of the demands was the complete resettlement of the entire population of Carthage inland, many kilometers away from the sea. This demand deprived the Carthaginians not only of their native city, but also of the very essence of their civilization, trade, and seafaring. For a people whose life and culture were inextricably linked to the sea, this was tantamount to destruction. Such an ultimatum provoked desperate resistance and predetermined a tragic outcome. The inhabitants of Carthage, realizing that it was not a question of peace, but of their complete eradication from the face of the earth, preferred death in battle to shameful exile and oblivion.
Thus began the last desperate defense of the great city. The siege of Carthage became one of the most brutal and bloody episodes in ancient history. Deprived of its fleet and army, the city heroically resisted the superior forces of the Romans for 3 years. Women cut off their hair to weave ropes for catapults, and everything that could be turned into weapons was melted down to metal. But the forces were too unequal. Ultimately, the Roman legions broke through the defenses and stormed the city. What was applied in this regard was not simply conquest, but methodical and cold-blooded destruction. Carthage was set on fire and burned for many days, until only smoking ruins remained of the once prosperous capital of a powerful empire. The Romans fulfilled their oath with terrifying literalism. The overwhelming majority of the inhabitants who fought to the last were killed in street battles in a similar massacre. The few female slaves who survived this hell were captured and sold into slavery, their fate sealed, to become living trophies of the victors. To erase even the memory of the great city, the Romans, according to legend, plowed the land on which it stood and sprinkled it with salt, so that nothing would ever grow there again. The territory that once belonged to proud Carthage became a new Roman province called Africa, becoming a breadbasket and providing resources for its conqueror. Thus ended the history of one of the cities of the ancient world, which became a formidable warning to all future enemies of Rome.
The legacy and lessons of the Punic Romans demonstrated an unyielding determination to win even when all seemed lost. After the disaster at Cannae, when Hannibal's army stood at the gates, all the states surrendered, but not Rome. The Republic mobilized all its resources, showing brilliant resilience and a willingness to continue working until the end.
The second pillar of Rome's success was its unique ability to adapt. Faced with the powerful Carthaginian fleet in the First Punic War, Rome, being exclusively a land power, quickly built a fleet and mastered new tactics of naval warfare. During the struggle against the genius Hannibal in Rome, the conscious futility of the system surpassed him in open platforms and moved on to the exhausting Fabian tactics, which allowed them to save precious time and deplete the force's impact. This flexibility and willingness to learn from their mistakes, understanding the best that the enemy had to offer, became the key to their ultimate victory. Finally, the role of careful calculation should not be underestimated. Unlike Carthage, which relied heavily on mercenary troops and supported subordinate peoples, Rome managed to forge stronger alliances on the Apennine Peninsula. Even in the most difficult moments, most of Rome's Italian allies remained confident that it had a stable rear and an inexhaustible source of resources. In the traditional view, the Punic Wars are a story of how perseverance, adaptability, and wise politics proved stronger than the military might and tactical genius of one man. Rome's victory ushered in a new era, shaping the contours of the world for centuries to come.